Okay, so welcome to Hebrew Story Hour. We're in Genesis 26 this morning, and if you're new today, what I do is I read 3 or 4 verses in the Hebrew and translate it, and I just work through the whole chapter that way, and then we have time for discussion and questions, and afterwards. So, and I think we'll have some time for that. I thought about dividing up this chapter this week, and there are a couple of places where we could, but I think I'm just going to work through the whole thing, and then we'll have some things to talk about. So this is about Isaac digging wells. If I had to put a title on our story today, Isaac and others digging wells. Actually, let me pause really there somehow. Got children. All right, so Genesis 26, may the Lord bless the reading of his word. Vayehi ra'av ba'aretz milvad hara'av harishon asher haya bimei Avraham vayelech Yitzchak el Avimelech Melech Pilishtim Gerara. Verse 2. Vayera elav Adonai vayomer al tered Mitzrayimah shechon ba'aretz asher omar elecha.
And tried to start it, just sounds the same. Really?
Okay. Elecha gur ba'aretz hazot ve'ehye imecha va'avarechecha ki lecha ulezarecha etain et kol ha'aratzon ha'el v'hakimoti et ha'shavua asher nishbati la'avraham avicha. Okay, verse 4. V'hirbeti et zarecha kechochavei hashemayim v'natati lezarecha et kol haratzon ha'el v'hit barachu v'zarecha kol goyei haaretz. Verse 5. Ekev asher shama Abraham v'koli vayishmor mishmarti mitzvotai chukotai v'torotai. Yeah, I'll pause there and go back and translate in verse 1. Now there was a famine in the land. Besides the famine, or the earlier famine, which was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Avimelech, king of the Philistines, to Gerar. And the Lord appeared to him, and he said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Reside in the land about which I will tell you. Sojourn in this land, so that I may be with you, and then I will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give these lands, all of these lands, and I will establish the oath," that's an important word here, which I have sworn to Abraham, your father. Verse 4. And I will multiply your offspring like the stars of the heavens, and I will give to your offspring all of these lands, and all the nations of the earth will bless themselves by your offspring. Because Abraham listened to my voice, and he kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my instructions. Okay, verse 6. Vayeshev Yitzchak bigrar. Vayish'alu anshe hamakom leishto. Vayomer achoti hi ki yare lemor ishti pen yaharguni anshe hamakom al rivka ki tovat marehi. Vayehi ki arachu lo sham hayamim. Vayashkef Avimelech Melech Pilishtim Ba'ad Hachalon. Vayar Vahine Yitzchak Mitzachek Et Rivka Ishto. Verse, I'll pause there. So translating with verse 6. And Isaac dwelled in Gerar, and the men of the place asked about his wife, and he said, she's my sister, because he was afraid to say my wife, thinking lest they will kill me, the men of the place will kill me over Rebecca, because she was very beautiful. In verse 8, and when the days were prolonged for him there, in other words, he'd lived there a long time, Avimelech looked down, Avimelech, the king of the Philistines, looked down behind the window, and he saw, and behold, Isaac he's cocking, messing around with Rebecca, his wife. Okay, verse 9. Vayikra Avimelech laYitzchak vayomer achine ishtcha hi ve'ech amarta achoti hi vayomer elav Yitzchak ki amarti pen amut aleha. Vayomer Avimelech, ma zot asita lanu, kim at shachav achad ha'am et ishtcha, v'heveta aleinu asham. Vayitzav Avimelech et kol ha'am lemor, hanogea ba'ish hazeh uva ishto mot yumat. Okay, going back to verse 9 to translate. And Avimelech called to Isaac and he said, oh, look, she's your wife. And how did you say, or how could you say, my sister? She's my sister. And Isaac said to him, because I said, lest I will die on account of her. So smooth that out to say, I didn't want to say, lest I would die on account of her. And Avimelech said, what is this you've done to us? One of the people could have easily lied with your wife, and you would have brought upon us guilt, Asham. And Avimelech commanded all of the people, saying, the one who touches this man or his wife will surely be put to death. Okay, verse 12. Vayizra Yitzchak ba'aretz hahi, vayimtza b'shana hahi, mea she'arim, vayivarechehu Adonai. Verse 13. Vayigdal ha'ish, vayelech haloch, vagadel ad ki gadal ma'od. Vayehi lo mikne tzon umikne vakar, va'avuda rabba, vayikenu Vayikanu oto pilishtim. Verse 15. V'chol haba'erot asher chafaru avdei aviv bimei Avraham aviv sitmum pilishtim vayimalaum afar vayomer Avimelech el Yitzchak lech me'imanu ki atzamta mimenu ma'od. In verse 17, Vayelech misham Yitzchak, Vayechan v'nachal Gerar, Vayeshiv sham. Okay, translating with verse 12. And Isaac sowed in that land, and he, this word means found, but here in this context, he reaped. And he reaped in that year 100-fold, and Yahweh blessed him. And the man became wealthy, or became great, but here it means wealth, and increasingly more wealthy until he was very wealthy. And he had livestock of sheep and livestock of cattle and many servants. And the Philistines envied him. And all of the wells which the servants of his father had dug in the days of Abraham, his father, they had stopped up. The Philistines had stopped up, and they filled with dirt. And Avimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are mightier than us, exceedingly mightier than us." And then verse 17, and he went from there, Isaac went from there, and he camped by the Wadi of Gerar, and he dwelled there. Okay, verse 18. Vayashov Yitzchak vayachpor et be'erot hayamim asher chafaru bimei Avraham aviv vayasatamum Pelishtim acharei mot Avraham vayikra lahen shemot kashemot asher kara lahen aviv. Verse 19. Vayachparu avdei Yitzchak b'nachal vayimtzu sham be'er mayim chayim. Verse 20. Vayarivu ro'e Gerar im ro'e Yitzchak lemor lanu hamayim vayikra shem haba'er eshek ki it asaku imo. Verse 21. Vayachpuru be'er acheret vayarivu gam alecha vayikra shema sitna. Verse 22. Vayatek misham vayachpor be'er acheret velo ravu aleha vayikra shema Rechovot, Vayomer Kiata Hirchiv Adonai Lanu, Ufarinu Ba'aretz, Vaya'al Misham Be'er Shava. Okay, pause there, verse 18 in translating. Now Isaac returned, and he dug the wells of water which in the days of Abraham, which they dug in the days of Abraham, his father. But the Philistines had stopped them after the death of Abraham. And he named them according to the names which he called them, or his father had called them. And the servants of Isaac dug in the wadi, and they found there a well of spring water, living water, Mayim Chayim. But the shepherds of Gerar disputed with the shepherds of Isaac, saying, the waters belong to us. And he named the well Asik, because they quarreled, they asked with him. And they dug another well, and they quarreled also over it. And he named it accusation, sitna. And Isaac, or he, moved on from there, and he dug another well, that they did not dispute over, and he named it Rechovot, so broad places. And he said, because now Yahweh has broadened for us, or made space for us, and we will be fruitful in the land. And he went up from there, to Beersheba. Okay, verse 24. Vayera elav Adonai, balayla hahu, vayomer anochi Elohei Avraham avicha, al tira ki itecha anochi, uverakticha behir beiti et zaraka, ba'avur Avraham avdi. Vayiven sham mizbeach, vayikram b'shem Adonai, vayet sham oholo, vayichru sham, avdei Yitzchak be'er. Okay, translate these two verses. 24. And Yahweh appeared to him in that night, and he said, I am the God of Avraham, your father. Do not be afraid, for I am with you, and I will bless you, and I will multiply your offspring for the sake of my servant Avraham. And he built there an altar, and he called on the name of Yahweh. And he stretched out his tent there, and he dug there, the servants of Isaac dug in that place a well. Okay, verse 26. Last kind of long section. Last long section. Avimelech halach al evav migrar va'achuzat mereahu ufichol sar tzva'o vayomer alehem Yitzchak madua batem elai va'atem senetem oti v'atishalachuni me'itechem. Verse 28. Vayomeru ra'o ra'inu ki haya Adonai imach. Vanomer tihi na Allah benotechnu benenu uvenecha benichrata verit imach. Im ta'aseh imanu ra'a ka'asher lo neganucha v'ka'asher asinu imacha rak tov v'anashalech chacha b'shalom atha baruch Adonai. Verse 30. Vaya'as lahem mishteh vayochulu vayishtu vayashkimu vaboker vayashavu ish la'achiv vayashalchem Yitzchak vayeluchu meito b'shalom. Okay, translating in verse 26. Now, Abimelech went to him from Gerar, and Achuzat, his close companion, and Phichol, the captain of his army. And he said to them, or Isaac said to them, why have you come to me? And you hated me, or maybe because, or when you hated me, and you sent me away from among you. And they said, we have clearly seen that Yahweh has been with you. And we said to ourselves, let's make an oath. Let there be an oath between us and between you. And let us make a treaty or cut a covenant with you. If you will be with us, well, this is, I want to rephrase this, but it's an oath formula. If there will be with us evil, so let there not be evil among us, just as, or maybe because we did not touch you, and just as we did not do with you any, we only did good to you. And we sent you away in peace. And you now are blessed of Yahweh. And he made for them a feast, and they ate, and they drank, and they got up early in the morning, and they swore each one to his brother. They made an oath. And Isaac sent them away, and they went away from him in peace. Okay, verse 32, really the conclusion of this story. Vayehi bayom hahu uyavohu avdei Yitzchak vayagidu lo al odot ha be'er asher chaffaru vayomeru lo matzanu mayim vayikra ota shiva al kain shem ha'ir be'er sheva ad hayom hazeh. So translating these verses, in that day, the servants of Isaac came and they told him about the well which they dug. And they said to him, we found water. And he named it Shiva, or oath. Therefore, the name of the city is Be'er Sheva until this day. I'm going to go ahead and do 34 and 35, but it's really something different, but just for completion's sake. So, Vayehi Esav ben Arba'im Shana, Vayikach Isha et Yehudit, Bat Be'eri Hachiti, Ve'et Basmat, Bat Elon Hachiti, Vatihyena Morat Ruach, LeYitzchak uLeRivka. Okay, so translating is, the translation is when Esau was 40 years old, he took a wife, Judith, or took as a wife, Judith, the daughter of Be'eri, the Hittite, and Basemat, the daughter of Elon, the Hittite. And they were bitterness of spirit to Isaac and Rebekah. Okay, Genesis 26. You know, it's not some of the tight narratives that we have in some of the other Genesis stories. Part of me hesitates to even say this is narrative. There's like a bunch of different narratives that are kind of stacked together in some way, but certainly there are themes. So let me throw it open for any questions or discussion. Anything you can ask about grammar, or often we end up talking about bigger thematic parts of the story.
I had a question about, you seem to switch a little bit between Yahweh and Adonai as you were dealing with the Yahweh word in these verses. So I wondered why you did that.
On accident. Good question. I didn't realize I was doing it. I try to use Yahweh, but often when I read it in Hebrew, I follow the Masoretic tradition of saying Adonai. But then when I translate it, I try to use Yahweh, because when the Masoretes, the people who are appointing the divine name, they put in the vowels for Lord, so that you would think Lord, and you would say Lord, but you're still seeing the divine name. In English translations, we're not seeing the divine name. So depending on my context, I try to use Yahweh so that we hear the personal name of God, to recognize that that's kind of what lies behind the text. But if I flip-flopped in my translation, that was just on accident, me not thinking about it.
You might have been following your philosophy, but I just didn't know your philosophy. So
yeah,
you know.
Yeah, I definitely say Adonai when I'm reading the Hebrew, but then try to flip it in translation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I was thinking about verse 4, the Hashemayim, when he's talking about the stars in the sky.
Right.
How do you know if Hashemayim is heavens or sky? Because we were talking about Genesis in the creation account, and
right,
the heavens versus the sky and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, for us, that those two are pretty distinct. You know, the blue sky up above and the heavens, or whatever we would call heaven. But for them, they're not so distinct. I mean, the realm above in Genesis 1, you have the Rakia. You look up and you call it Shemayim. But God seems to dwell above the Rakia in some other visions. So I'm not so sure, what's going on. Certainly they have, in the Hebrew Bible, they would have space for thinking about the realm of the Lord. When you talk about heaven and earth, right, there's distinction between the two. But I don't think that, I think they would have thought about the dwelling place of God, where the throne, where God's holy mountain is in the kind of the heavenly realm, would have been up and would have been placed upon the Shemayim, or above the Shemayim, perhaps, or the kind of the upper parts of it. But it's also when the ancient Israelites look into the skies and they see the stars, sometimes they'll recognize the stars as heavenly hosts, or sort of the armies of God. So they're seeing something more than sort of, or at least maybe they're seeing the same skies, but it's got a fuller sense of meaning when they look into the Shemayim and the Chochavim.
I have a question on that, Lance, if it's okay.
Yeah, for sure.
I believe you're correct on the three-part cosmology of the Hebrew world in that early time, and I think it carries on. There's an interesting, I think, really nice phenomena in Matthew, where what Jesus really speaks about literally is the kingdom of the heavens.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the English translation doesn't render it that way, because that's exclusive to Matthew. But I wonder, do you think for the Jewish readers of that gospel, if this would have some meaning for them, because
You mean the plural?
Hashemayim, yeah, the plural of
Yeah.
Hashemayim and the heavens. It seems to me like a lovely connection, and I wish they would just translate. But I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, this would be a good one for the group to chime in on too. So I would, yeah, I mean, I do think they would. It is a connection back with the kingdom of God being the kingdoms of the heavens, the Shemayim. So Shemayim is always plural, and so I think it's, when you have collective, well, we have plural nouns that kind of stand for a singular thing. So collective nouns. It's legitimate to translate it in a singular sense, even in Hebrew, I think, heaven. And so it's hard to tell on the basis of grammar, even Hebrew, whether they would have thought of kind of the plurality of it, what the plural really signifies. Yes, I do think that there's a connection, the kingdom of the heavens. I think that's what you're making a good point with. Relates to the Shemayim. Matthew seems to be intentionally making that connection. Usually what I hear Matthew's motive being that he doesn't want to say kingdom of God somehow. So he's like not using God, he's using heaven as a way of just sort of rephrasing it, but almost like a negative. But perhaps there's this kind of positive side of making this connection.
Yeah, one thing I find meaningful about it is that it emphasizes the reign of God in all realms, on earth, in imminent or in the celestial heaven, and then of course in his domain. I just find that really a beautiful thought, and I think and then from the beginning, he's the one bara of the Hashemayim Haaretz, like he's the one, and this comes up constantly all the way through the Bible. He's the creator of the heavens and the earth.
Yeah, I like your point that sort of thinking about this kind of, it's not heavens, heavens includes kind of, is more of an expansive idea, perhaps, and that Jesus is king over all of it. That reminds me of may let your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah.
Right. So this kind of this coming down of the reign of God. Certainly the reign of God works really well. In some ways, it's not so spatial as it is, I don't know what the word, kind of a quality of righteousness. That's good. Other ideas on that or other questions, reflections? We have seen parts of this story before, or at least this is Isaac's story, like Genesis 12 and 20 we saw with Abraham, once with Abimelech, and then once with the Egyptians, where Isaac is pretending or lying that his to the foreign camp, foreign ruler, about his wife being his sister. And it's an interesting thing that the Hebrew Bible does. I mean, that these kind of like, should we read this as, Isaac kind of falling into the pitfalls of Abraham? On the other hand, in both of these stories, I mean, Abraham grows in wealth whenever he visits this, and Isaac grows in wealth. Like, they end up being blessed because of the particular scenario. There's really no judgment except by the foreign king, like Abimelech says, how could you do this to us? Why would you lie to us? And he just says, well, I thought you'd kill me. And then they move on and they don't punish him, they bless him. So in the end, it's like whatever Isaac is up to here, God is blessing. And there's some ambiguity, I think, about whether, Isaac is wrong for lying about his wife. Noel?
I
Or
like
Noel,
the
sorry.
play on words in verse 8, the Yitzhak, Mitzhak.
Yeah. Right. We've seen,
Never noticed that before.
yeah, Isaac's name is played on all the way through. We had this with Ishmael, that he's somehow Yitzhaking Isaac as a child, and that, of course, makes Sarah upset, and Sarah Hagar narratives. But this one, yeah, there's all different. There's that seems to be like a taunt or making fun of. It could be playing with, but this one certainly has a different meaning. That no doubt something like that's a purposeful wordplay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some will use this reference though to interpret the other. This is clearly something that a husband is doing to a wife or with a wife, and the guy looks on him and knows that they're married, right? So there's fondling, or sometimes it's translated that way. Sometimes interpreters take this meaning of the wordplay and relate it to the Ishmael wordplay and think that there's some sort of sexual abuse in the Isaac story, or the Ishmael Isaac story. The story itself there, I don't think that's there. I mean, I wouldn't make that argument, but some would. It's kind of, when there's wordplay, there's kind of this expansive idea of what Yitzhaking can be. I mean, of course, you have the Abraham and Sarah stories about them. They both individually laugh, the verbal part of it. So, but more than any other name among the patriarchs, Isaac's name is played on.
We see the word again at the golden calf.
Yeah.
Do you have, I know that isn't our text for today, but do you have a view as to which connotation is the connotation from this chapter, or the connotation from the Ishmael incident, or something else?
Right. So that is, so Exodus 32, when they're partying around they make an altar and around the calf, and they're worshiping. So some interpreters would take that as that there's like this, they're having an orgy. Like some would say that there's always a sexual connotation in the word plays. There's really not a word play in Exodus 32. It's just the use of the verb. It ranges from that to always just like having a good time, laughing, or maybe something in between. I don't know. Exposing nakedness upon an altar is like totally prohibited and forbidden. Of course, there's a lot that they're doing that would be forbidden, building or making a calf, right? Or making an idol to represent Yahweh or the gods that brought them out. So there's a lot. It's hard to know what's built into that. I wouldn't argue. I'm not convinced that in Exodus 32 that it's got sexual connotations, although it could be that. It just doesn't. There's nothing else in the text that makes that clear. And like, this is the only text that I know about where that's clear, that it has a sexual connotation.
I remember hearing a class one time where the guy was talking about this passage. He had an interesting point. I don't know that it's right or wrong per se, but it was interesting to hear. He was talking about this in the idea that a husband and wife have an interesting way of interacting with one another. And you sort of build a history together, and you find a similar sense of humor and so forth. And there was almost this idea of Avimelech was looking at them, and he was like, only a husband and wife can laugh with each other this way.
Oh.
And I thought there was a fair point to be had there. Like I said, I don't know that that's right per se, but I thought it was worthwhile, at least, that I think there's truth to that, whether or not that's what this is. That it helps somebody.
So he would be looking upon them and saying, that's not a brother-sister laugh.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So it may or may not have a direct sexual connotation to it, but like this is the interaction of husband and wife. I can just tell. I thought that was one other. This is maybe unrelated, but what I find interesting in the blessing to follow, he sows and reaps 100-fold.
Yeah.
And I can't help but think of the parable of the sower. Some of the good soils 30, 60, or even 100-fold. And I don't know that there's a correlation to that per se, but it just always catches my ear every time I read it.
Yeah, those are important connections. The word there is interesting. It's a kind of an unusual word. Mea is 100. This is verse 12. And she'arim is the 100-fold, the fold part of this. Si'arim, if we just, instead of a sheen, you have a scene there, you have barley. So 100 barleys. And I think it's the Septuagint that, or at least one version of the Greek that takes it that way. So you have 100 barleys, and that reminds me of the Ruth story or something, the kind of the abundance. But just because barley is such a big deal in Ruth, more than anything. But I mean, 100-fold probably works best here. The she'arim instead of si'arim. Yeah, good. Other questions or comments?
Yeah, I'm just again to study a little bit about Hebrew. So I wonder how much Hebrew is used in the world today.
Today, well, Hebrew is a fascinating language, and it's very unusual in some ways that modern Hebrew is Hebrew resurrected. Hebrew essentially died as a spoken language, except for in the synagogue or in religious settings where Torah was being read or scripture was being read. This basically became a liturgical language. But then with the state of Israel and before this, there was kind of a move to bring back Hebrew as a spoken language. So what we know as modern Hebrew is partly based on biblical Hebrew, but it's also a mix that's, you have Yiddish, some German terms, you have, words that aren't in the Hebrew Bible that they borrow from other languages. So modern Hebrew is, a thriving language. And there are enough similarities to say, to see how they relate. Like if you know biblical Hebrew and you go over to Israel, you can read some of their words, and you might be able to hear a few things that are familiar. But biblical Hebrew is no longer spoken.
So do they use the same alphabet as what's in the Bible?
Yeah, same alphabet, same characters. A lot of times you'll see Hebrew written without the vowel pointing, the dots above or below the letters. They obviously have vowels when they speak it, but that's true for ancient Hebrew too. But yeah, it's the same. It looks the same as the Hebrew that we're reading. Of course, when we look at the VHS, which is what I'm reading out of, right? Or if you have a Bible in front of you, it's probably what you have. The script itself is called Aramaic block script. It's actually borrowed from Aramaic, a different language, but related language, but same script. And Phoenician uses the same script. And then Hebrew, if you looked at an inscription from the 8th century or the 7th century BC in Hebrew, it would not look like this script. The writing itself, same alphabet, different way of writing the letters. And that really takes shape, even if you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, which would be 3rd century or 2nd century BC. The script is looking more and more like what we have here, but there's some different distinctions. In any case, once they start anything that's typed is going to be using the same script that modern Hebrew would use.
I find it really interesting that if you look at some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, while most of the text looks more like the alphabet we're used to, when it comes to the Tetragrammaton, they will revert to the more ancient Hebrew letters,
Yeah.
just so it stands out and pops off the page a little better.
Yeah, there's that they do that with some scrolls and not with others, but yeah, they'll use basically the early Hebrew writings form for the divine name as a way, yeah, that's right, to make it stand out. So, and there's not vowel pointing in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's vowel pointing is the way the Masoretes made the divine name distinguished by putting the vowels in for Adonai. Where in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they didn't do that. They didn't have vowel pointing. So some of them still, yeah, distinguished the name by writing it in an archaic script. Other times, if they don't do that, they'll put dots above it, like 4 dots above the divine name, almost as a way of marking it and say, don't say it, sort of. So there's an early tradition of not pronouncing the divine name.
I was thinking about that issue. In a very real sense, in English, we carry the same tradition. We don't say the divine name. We
Right.
say Lord. Hebrew, Adonai is just the Hebrew for Lord. So
Right.
I'm like, we don't pronounce it either.
No,
It's kind
for
of
sure.
funny. I feel like as Christians and Americans largely, we kind of point to that and go, "That's so ridiculous that they don't say it." And I'm like, "You don't say it either."
Right.
We don't retranslate all the small capitals Lord and put in there Yahweh or
Right.
whatever it actually sounds like. So I think it's kind of funny that we kind of hang up on that sometimes.
No, yeah, we're still, our English translations are still carrying on the tradition, even maybe more so. Sometimes this is what I was saying earlier, the way that we do it really obscures, unless and this is an important teaching point, I think, in our churches, that the Lord in all caps represents the divine name. So that's the personal name of God. Like, you just have to say that over and over so that people, so it's significant that God gives Israel his name. He doesn't give him a title. He gives him a name, and Lord is a title. So we can kind of miss that, the intimacy in some ways, or the vulnerability even, that God gives in this gift of giving the name. As far as the tradition goes, sometimes now it's like modern or Judaism, and this is not a new, has gone another step further. They call God Hashem, so the name. They'll use that instead of the divine name. Sometimes even in English, you'll see people write G-D. So yeah, the Septuagint uses Kurios, so Lords. It's an early tradition that we're still carrying on.
God, do you know how to pronounce the name of God?
Yeah, that's Yahweh gets at it. Likely, it's because it's the Heys. It's Yod Hey Vav Hey. Usually, the 2 vowels that are used with Hey are these A class and a segul Eh. It could be Yava, something like that, but we don't know perfectly how they might have said it. But the Vav historically would have been pronounced as a W, a W sound, even though that when we read Hebrew now, in our tradition, most modern traditions, the Vav is pronounced as a V sound.
So, something that I was thinking about with kind of the name of God, so to speak, is, I think it's verse 24, God speaking to Isaac, and he says, "Don't be afraid," but we also call God the fear of Isaac. And I was like, that seems like an interesting kind of paradox, maybe, that it's like, don't fear, and then later he's referred to as the fear of Isaac.
Yeah, it's fear is, we're supposed to fear the Lord, but then when God shows up, he often says, don't fear, don't be afraid. Yeah, that's certainly that's there. And it's interesting, even what he says right after that is, because I am with you. And I think he's here, is he saying, don't be afraid to see me? Because it doesn't seem like I am with you would bring him any comfort then. But, or maybe he's, don't be afraid being in a foreign land because I'm with you. This is what God says to Moses in Exodus 3. I will be with you. Just sort of this, which I'm sure that's not the only place we see this, but Moses is in fear of going, to Egypt to proclaim, the release of the captives.
I think there's probably a link with fear of Isaac and the Akedah.
Yes, yeah. In particular, and I'm trying to remember, so Genesis 22, how does that relate? Where is that? What verse is that? What would the link be with the Akedah, chapter 22?
You're tied up on the altar.
Yeah.
At God's command, I think that would instill fear in anyone.
Yeah, well, for sure. Yeah, and that story, it's Abraham's fear, like verse 12 of chapter 22. For now I know that the fear of God is, or you have the fear of God. But yeah, no doubt Isaac would have been scared, terrified in the moment. Just interesting in that story, you also have a connection with, no, it really doesn't really, Beersheba comes up several times.
And Sheva can be 7 or oath. Is that right?
Yeah, Sheva is the number 7, but
right.
So these are kind of etiological stories for how we get the name, how Beersheba became a city, and its name. And clearly here it's tied with the oath, especially
with Abraham, it was 7 ewe lambs or something, right?
Yeah, I was trying to
make an oath.
We have had other etiological stories for Beersheba, because it's such an important place for Abraham. Was that, and so it's there, it plays on 7. That's a good observation. Here we just have over and over the oath. And like verse 3:33 really brings it home. He called it Shiva, which is not the same thing as Sheva. 7 is Sheva, but Shiva would be oath. He called it oath. Therefore, the name of the city is Beersheba. And this is generally, it's true that the naming of places and the origins of the names don't always have to match up perfectly with the verbs or the nouns that they're being associated with. Kind of have the same consonants here. But it's almost, this story almost makes it sound like Isaac is naming the place, whereas Abraham named it earlier. But there is all this connection throughout, especially with the digging of the wells, between Isaac and Abraham. Sort of like Abraham had been gone a while, and there Isaac is coming back to the homestead and starting his people again. So Isaac's kind of living into the ways of Abraham. I just on a personal note, this idea of redigging the wells is there's this book called Redigging the Wells, written by my grandfather. And if anybody has known, like says, oh, I know your family, it's usually because my grandfather wrote this book. So I was looking at it earlier this morning. he wrote it the year that I was born. We were talking about the year I was born earlier. So he wrote this in 1976. And he starts with quoting Genesis 26, 17 and 18, just this idea of, I mean, he doesn't talk a whole lot about the story, but anyway, that was just self-indulgence, me sharing that.
With that, one of the things that I was interested in is in verse 19, they talk about the water springing, or the living water coming, I think you said. And that whole concept, I think, is very interesting, that they're looking for wells of living water. And then, of course, through the remainder of I don't know if I'd say the narrative, but the remainder of the Old Testament, you see, like, I think of Jeremiah particularly, whenever he's talking about, they have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, for broken cisterns. Like, it's just interesting to think about that, and the living water kind of coming up here, where it's like you have this flowing water now,
right?
In a wilderness place where they'd stopped up the wells.
Yeah, there is a big difference between Mayim Chaim, like the living water. It's a spring fed, right? So it's continually being fed, whereas a cistern is just basically a basin to capture rainwater, right? And they're in a wadi, and we can't forget that in this story there's a famine, right? So they're searching for water, and who's going to get the water, and they're competing with the Philistines over it, and now they find it. This celebration of not just a little, but it's just we're okay. There's a famine, but we're okay. And there's reaping and sowing in this story. So there's like this kind of abundance in comparison with the famine. But great reference in Jeremiah that, just kind of this image of God's giving you living water, but you are satisfied, or you're not, you're not taking what's being given with this, taking the cisterns. Yeah.
I think it's also Ezekiel where he talks about the idea that the temple from Jerusalem, like all directions, living water will be flowing out from it in the last days, where it's just like there will be this abundance. And then you can't help but go, I think, to the book of John and see all of these things about Jesus. Will talk at least twice, maybe a third time, about him being associated with the production of living water. And it's one of those, again, where people go, he never claims to be God. And I'm like, but who is able to provide living water other than God?
Right.
I'm like, he's saying it there, and it usually makes the Pharisees very angry.
Anyway. For sure. The Ezekiel 37 text is awesome. And it replenishes or renews the Dead Sea, flows from the temple down into the Dead Sea to be this life-giving water lake. And then, Jesus in John is all about the water, John 4, of course, but you're right. Living water, by the way, is moving at Qumran. If you go there, they have all these like waterways, and it's in the desert, but having living water for purification was really important. So they move the water from basin to basin, or from the mikvah ot, and the ritual baths, so that it would be living water, even though it wasn't spring fed. It was living water because it was moving. So relates to rivers and purification and these types of things. Water that brings life, not just that it has a source of life.
It's prominent at the end of the Bible too, in Revelation.
Yeah.
Where there's the invitation to come and drink from this water.
Yeah. That's good. And Revelation is all about, really is looking back to like texts like Ezekiel. These images are really important.
And Exodus. And the thing that's really wonderful in Deuteronomy 8, that God said you'll be coming into a land of brooks and streams and springs flowing in the mountains and the hills. And when you look at how many places in Israel depend on these springs, namely like Jerusalem, Tel Dan, and Gedi.
You have to have it.
Yeah. Yeah, 40% of the water in the Galilee system and Jordan come from the springs of Dan.
Right.
So at the top of Israel,
Right.
from Dan to Beersheba, you know,
It
the whole
flows
thing.
down. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're at the end of our time here, so going to conclude Hebrew Story Hour for this week. We'll be back next week with Genesis 27. It's a long chapter. I don't know if we'll do the whole thing. I've learned my lesson on trying to do too much, but we'll see. But thank you for your time, for being with us. I look forward to seeing you all again. If you want to hang out and talk, we can, but otherwise I'm going to stop the recording here.
Thank you.
Shalom Lachem.